7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Reacteria. Today, we're going to be looking at this video from Answers in Genesis, debunking all the best proof of evolution in 12 minutes. Now right away, before the video has even begun, we have a bit of a problem here. And this is going to sound like I'm being a little bit nitpicky, and in all fairness, I kind of am, but with this video in particular, it's important, and I'll tell you why in a second. Science deals in evidence, not in proof. You may occasionally hear a scientist use words like proof or proven when they're speaking casually, or when they really mean that there's so much evidence for something that it would be silly to dismiss it, but the truth is, science is describing reality, not defining reality. The best models and the best theories that we have are representations of reality, not reality itself. And for that reason, we try to avoid using words like proof because we could always be wrong. Now, as I said, I am being a bit pedantic here. If this was any other video from any other author, I would make that point a footnote if I mentioned it at all. But when we're talking about Answers in Genesis, it's important that we let as little slide as possible, because Answers in Genesis never argues in good faith, and has a long track record of using the tiniest bit of leeway to justify massive leaps in reason. They misrepresent scientific ideas, they quote mine scientists, they straight up lie about what evidence is available and what evidence is in the first place, and their entire business model is built upon leveraging the either-or fallacy in order to sell, and I do mean sell, their insane worldview. So when they say that they're debunking proofs of evolution, I'm not going to give them the same courtesy that I would give anybody else of assuming that they're just creating a catchy title for their video. Knowing them, it's much more likely that they picked this word on purpose, knowing that a large portion of their audience is never going to watch this video because they're already bought in, so that title is all they're going to need to validate their beliefs, and the people who do watch it are going to be much more swayed under the false pretense that evolution has now been disproven, that it's only a theory, and that Answers in Genesis has just revealed some secret that the evil evolutionists didn't want you to know. Titles like this are how creationist apologists trick their victims into believing that what they're doing is anywhere close to science, when the reality is the most impressive thing that Answers in Genesis could do in this video is to successfully challenge some of the evidence for evolution. That's a pretty big leap from disproving it, and it's a light year away from providing any evidence for creation. But hey, that's just the title. Now that we're past that, let's look at the first few seconds of this video, which opens with Calvin Smith reading a pretty pointed comment.
The fossil record proves evolution happened. Don't you idiots understand science? Evolution is a fact. No matter what specific topic you're discussing regarding the creation-evolution debate, whenever an article or video is posted where the comment section's open, comments like the ones I just said are sure to appear. And those are some of the nicer ones.
So he read one comment and then talked about the comments and that those were some of the nicer ones. So obviously he actually read several comments and then they cut them out later before they released a video. No big deal, right? But it makes you wonder why. Again, just like with the proof thing, because it's Answers in Genesis, I'm forced to treat them a little bit differently than I would treat anybody else. If this were any other video, I would just assume that the other comments were redundant and maybe a little bit lengthy, and so they cut them out during the editing process to make the video flow better. But because it's Answers in Genesis, the guileful group of gaslighting grifters who have a long and what should be a shameful history of taking quotes from famous scientists wildly out of context to make it sound like they're all secretly anti-evolution, or that they're racist like they did in that movie about their creation museum, I can't help but wonder if they just didn't want too many sound bites of Calvin saying the words evolution is true floating around the internet, because they know better than any honest person just how dangerous quote mining can be.
And I can honestly see why. Growing up the way I did, with no influence from the church, the Bible, or even any deistic religious viewpoint whatsoever, The story of evolution was so firmly established in my mind as science and fact that anyone who questioned it seemed rather untethered from reality to me.
It's clear right from the beginning here that Calvin is attempting to build a bridge to the people who would dismiss his videos out of hand by saying, listen, I get it. I used to think that people like me were crazy too. And that's how he's going to establish the hook of saying, once I allowed myself to start questioning the dogma of evolution, I realized it was all a big lie. The problem is, what he's describing here isn't how someone with a good science education thinks. Getting to explore new ideas is always a good thing. And questioning evolution, just like questioning any part of science, can only lead to more knowledge, as long as you're willing to listen to the answers that you find. I don't know what kind of childhood Calvin is claiming to have had here, but if he was taught to accept science unquestioningly and to look down on people who are less educated for simply being less educated, then I think he was done a major disservice.
I found it hard not to view them with intellectual contempt, as anyone denying the overwhelming proof of the story of evolution based on facts like dinosaur fossils, ape-man skulls, the 98% similarity between chimp and human DNA, the geologic column, etc., seemed idiotic, to put it bluntly.
Well, that's crappy. But we were all young and engaged in childish thinking at one point or another. Maybe it's because I have a background in education that I take this a little bit more seriously than other people might, but I don't think you should ever shame somebody for simply questioning evolution. I'll shame somebody for arrogance, or for assuming that their questions alone supersede the answers of experts, or for not following the evidence, or for spreading lies and misinformation, especially when it's harmful. But 99 times out of 100, anytime somebody is questioning evolution, it's because they just haven't learned that much about it. Or because they've listened to people like Calvin who conflate evidence and proof and who claim that they can debunk the glue that holds all of biology together by just going nuh-uh a whole bunch. That's the behavior that I would call idiotic.
I truly remember feeling just that harshly towards those I considered what would today be called science deniers.
I get comments and emails and even letters quite frequently from people who had a religious upbringing or who were homeschooled or for some other reason didn't get a good science education and whose first exposure to science, especially to evolution, is my videos. So I know for sure that right now there are a lot of people watching this who are on the fence about evolution, who don't know too much about it and are trying to figure out who to believe. And to those people, I want you to know that, at least in my opinion, there's a big difference between somebody who isn't scientifically literate but is trying their best and a science denier. You see, what Calvin is trying to do here is establish this victimhood for creationists, that they're being bullied by these evil evolutionists that call them stupid in the comment section just for disagreeing with them. This confession is meant to create this boogeyman that is the evil atheist that's out to hurt your feelings. It's an emotional trick. So if you're in the group that Calvin is trying to appeal to right now, two things. Number one, thank you for being here. And number two, everybody's going to use these terms differently, and there's going to be jerks everywhere you go. But for me at least, a science denier is somebody who puts the time and effort that they should have invested into learning science, listening to experts, and asking good questions into memorizing straw man talking points, sowing distrust in experts, and spreading misinformation. You know, like Calvin. The point is, somebody who honestly doesn't understand science isn't automatically a science denier in my book. It's somebody who actively rejects the evidence. Somebody who buys into and then pushes things like creationism, anti-vax, flat earth, transphobia, climate change denial, chemtrails. Those are the people who are science deniers because they are actively denying science. You don't have to be like that. Just stay curious, ask good questions, and follow the answers.
And when you feel that you have the full weight of science and an avalanche of truth in support of your beliefs, any opinion in contradiction to it seems so weak and dismissible as to be beneath serious consideration. And of course, the internet tends to encourage some bad behavior sometimes.
By bad behavior, do you mean platforming lunatics as long as they agree with you about creationism, like we saw you do with Walter Veith? Or do you mean misquoting scientists to make them sound evil, like we saw you do with Stephen Jay Gould? Or do you just mean occasionally spicy YouTube comments?
I think of it metaphorically like a gang leader that's so sure of himself with all of his backup behind him ready to help him out whenever he wants. But what if he spun around to find out that there was no one standing there to rely on? You see, that's just what happened to me.
And that's why he's no longer a gang leader. It all makes perfect sense now.
When I was finally challenged in my belief in materialism and had to present the evidence in support of it. And when I was asked what the best proofs of evolution I could muster were, I turned around with all this cockiness and confidence I could portray and found out that many of the proofs I'd put my faith and trust in had disappeared without me knowing it.
Oh, well then you had a bad science education. You should be just as upset about that as I am. A good science education would have taught you what we know and how we know it so that you never have to rely on faith. But just because the situation started out bad doesn't mean that you have to leave it bad. In fact, I've been in more or less the same situation that Calvin just described, and it's a big part of why I became a scientist. I wanted to be an educator, so I got a job teaching after-school programs for elementary school students, and it didn't take long for those third graders to ask some really tough questions like,
how do you know what atoms are made of? How do you know what the speed of light is?
And when I realized that I didn't have a good answer, when I was the lone gang leader in an empty parking garage, it drove me crazy, so I spent a lot of time studying to try to figure it out. Skip forward several years, and if we're honest, too many college degrees, and here I am making videos on the internet about grown adults who are asking those exact same third grade questions and refusing to provide an answer so that they can sell you on the narrative that the only right answer is Jesus.
A hallmark of evolutionary thinking is the idea of change over time. And this notion certainly plays itself out whenever someone asks the question, what are the best proofs of evolution? Especially if we were to do so throughout history.
The best evidence for evolution, in my opinion, is the fact that you can literally watch it happening. We have several different experiments, both in the laboratory and in the field, showing populations of a variety of different species experiencing genotypic and phenotypic changes across multiple generations. Of course, there's also homology, embryology, fossils, genetics, and so on, but the fact that you can literally watch it happening with your own eyes is pretty darn compelling for a lot of new learners.
What if we were to do that from way back in the day, all the way up to the 2000s?
Or you could grapple with modern evidence, instead of doing what you guys always do, which is look for one time that one scientist was wrong about one thing and use that to imply that all science is wrong all the time, unless it happens to agree with your preferred interpretation of your preferred translation of your preferred version of your preferred holy book.
For example, let's begin by asking that question at the time of the launch of the book that's the bedrock of modern evolutionary thought, Darwin's Origin of Species,
which was published in the 1850s. Darwin got some stuff right, Darwin got some stuff wrong, but we have over 150 years worth of better, more accurate evidence for evolution than that one book. Starting a conversation about whether or not evolution is real by referencing On the Origin of Species is like starting a conversation about whether or not the Earth revolves around the sun by referencing On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. Copernicus was right about the heliocentric model, but he was wrong about some parts of it, and we have hundreds of years worth of more evidence supporting that idea. The exact same thing goes for Darwin. This is a terrible place to start this argument.
Well, in 1859, you might have been presented with Neanderthal man as proof of our evolutionary ancestry, even though they'd been found 4 years earlier and had already been declared fully human by a professional anatomist.
I don't know what single anatomist he's talking about here, but one scientist being wrong about a fossil 150 years ago, when the idea of human ancestry was still largely unheard of, is not a serious jab at evolution. Also, I know this isn't what they're talking about right now, but just so we're all on the same page, Neanderthals were humans because anything in the genus Homo is a human. So our species is called Homo sapiens, their species is called Homo neanderthalensis. We are two different species of humans. I just want to point that out going into this section because a lot of new learners are so used to thinking of our species as the only humans left that they end up thinking of our species as the only humans, period. And they end up doing what Calvin just did, which is to assume that the word human is synonymous with only our species, and that's just not true.
However, the release of Darwin's book fueled the search for fossils of imagined ape-like ancestors of man in the evolution-believing community. And lo and behold, 4 years later, Irish geologist William King decided to re-examine the fossil skull of Neanderthal man and promptly decided that he was an ape-like creature. And many variations of this idea were propagated as science and fact for well over 150 years afterwards.
Neanderthals were ape-like because all humans are ape-like because humans are great apes. What Calvin is doing, once again, is conflating terms to fit his worldview. By ape-like, he means primitive or ancestral, which is sort of true of thinking at the time, but again, that was over 100 years ago. Modern fossil, genetic, and archaeological evidence shows that our species lived contemporaneously with Neanderthals and interbred with them quite a bit, but they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. That makes them the predecessors of modern humans, but it does not make them the predecessors of our species or the predecessors of humans in general.
Today, of course, evolutionists have admitted their true humanity.
We learned that they are humans, not that they are Homo sapiens. Also, learning and admitting are two different things. That's very loaded language from a man who believes in dragons.
Which is why they're designated as Homo, which means human, Neanderthals.
Neanderthalensis. Not Homo Neanderthals, Homo Neanderthalensis. If you're going to claim to be smarter than all the professionals in this field, you should at least try to get the words right.
And definitive confirmation comes from no less than Dr. Eric Trinkhaus, an evolution-believing paleoanthropologist, considered one of the world's foremost authorities on Neanderthal man, who's concluded, detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there's nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans.
Isn't it funny how real scientists, even the ones who believe in evolution, are correct and trustworthy as long as it sounds like they're agreeing with Answers in Genesis? For the record, that quote from Dr. Trinkhaus is from an article published in Natural History magazine back in 1978. At that time, Neanderthals were classified as a subspecies of Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, sort of like how modern dogs are a subspecies of Canis lupus called Canis lupus familiaris. So that's what Dr. Trinkhaus was talking about in that article. And not long after that article was published, Neanderthals were reclassified as their own species, Homo neanderthalensis, because while they don't differ significantly in terms of ability, they do differ significantly in terms of morphology and genetics. And while Dr. Trinkhaus certainly didn't have access to the genetic evidence from the last couple of decades back in the 70s, he was aware of at least some of those major morphological differences even back when he wrote that article. How do I know that? Well, we have a little technique that we like to employ on this channel. Whenever a creationist quotes a real scientist as saying that evolution is sketchy or untrustworthy, we find the original quote and we read the next sentence. Detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains don't indicate abilities inferior to those of modern humans. We got all that. Neanderthals have therefore been added to the same species as ourselves, Homo sapiens, although they are usually placed in their own subspecies, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. Despite these revisions, it is apparent that there are significant anatomical differences between the Neanderthals and present-day humans. If we are to understand the Neanderthals, we must formulate hypotheses as to why they evolved from earlier humans around 100,000 years ago. And then it goes on to say, we must determine, therefore, the behavioral significance of the anatomical differences between the Neanderthals and other human groups, since it is patterns of successful behavior that dictate the direction of natural selection for a species. He did not say that Neanderthals were the exact same thing as Homo sapiens, and therefore we have no proof of evolution. He said Neanderthals are very clearly quite different than Homo sapiens and have a different evolutionary history from Homo sapiens, but they are being reclassified as a subspecies because of some key similarities. To someone who isn't familiar with biology, all this talk of reclassification can sound like we're just changing the rules to fit our own desires. But there's a couple important things to remember. Number one is that reclassification happens because the classification system that we use doesn't just tell you about one individual species at a time. It also tells you about everything that that one species is related to. So if we find new information that tells us that this one species isn't actually related to the other things that we thought it was, it makes sense that we would reclassify it to better reflect the data that we have. That isn't sacrificing science for the benefit of our narrative. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Somebody found better evidence and made a better argument, so we changed the narrative for the benefit of better science. And the second thing is, as frustrating as it may be to try to keep track of all these little changes, remember to pay attention to the major consistencies as well. Whether you're talking about Eric Trinkhaus today or back in the 1970s, he would say that Neanderthals existed tens of thousands of years before Answers in Genesis thinks the world was even created. And they certainly don't pay attention to his legitimate scientific expertise on that issue. It's only when they can find a single sentence from 40 years ago that kind of almost sounds like he agrees with them that they are willing to pretend that they take him or any other honest scientist even remotely seriously.
Now, obviously, humans evolving into humans isn't exactly proof of evolution. So you can scratch them off the list, as Neanderthals certainly aren't proof positive of evolution anymore.
And here, Answers in Genesis sets up their usual straw man that it isn't really evolution unless it involves a change in kinds, which I'll remind you isn't anywhere in the definition of evolution, nor is it a biological term. It's just a silly goalpost that they made for themselves so that they can move it anywhere they need to in order to satisfy their own argument. More importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't evolve from Neanderthals. We lived alongside them and we interbred with them quite a bit, but they are not the ancestors of all humans or even all Homo sapiens. They were just another species of humans that lived a little while ago. They are, however, very good evidence of evolution, as is any extinct species, because they did exist and they didn't come from nowhere. The fact that you find different creatures the farther down you dig remains an undeniable thorn in the side of creationism that creationists usually just have to explain away with a big ol' flood.
However, moving on to 1861, you may have finally found yourself presented with some rock-solid proof in the form of a missing link between dinosaurs and birds, called Archaeopteryx. Good old Archae was used for decades to convince people that a true transitional fossil between lizards and birds had been found.
In all fairness, people only said that because it's true.
But alas, in 1977, an admitted true bird was found which dates, according to evolutionist methods, at 60 million years older than Archaeopteryx, which means Archae couldn't be the transition to birds from lizards if birds already existed. Professor John Ostrom of Yale acknowledged, "We must now look for the ancestors of flying birds in a period of time much older than that in which Archaeopteryx lived."
My favorite part about that section is that they literally showed the article that they were lying about on screen and just hoped that nobody would read it. If you zoom in right here, you'll see that the article actually says the newly discovered bone is some 60 million years older than the previously found oldest birds. But it doesn't say that it's older than Archaeopteryx. In fact, the next sentence says the newly discovered bone is of the same time period as Archaeopteryx. And then you get the quote from Ostrom saying we need to look earlier for clues of bird evolution. He didn't say we found a bird that's 60 million years older than Archaeopteryx. He said we found a bird that's about as old as Archaeopteryx. And that brings us to the really important thing here. Archaeopteryx is not proposed as the single common ancestor of all birds. It's just a great example of the kind of transition you would see on the path along the way to birds. It had a mosaic of reptilian and avian characteristics, like a beak and teeth, wings and claws, a long tail and feathers, and we see all of those different traits across several different species in various phases of transition for several million years before and after Archaeopteryx. So even if what Answers in Genesis was saying was true, trying to dismiss Archaeopteryx because somebody found a different bird back then is like trying to dismiss the Wright brothers because Leonardo da Vinci was drafting flying machines back in the 1400s. The most important thing to remember here is that transitional doesn't necessarily mean ancestral. For example, there are several species in the genus Homo and in the species Australopithecus that show various transitions into the hominin-specific adaptations that humans exhibit today. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of those species was our direct ancestor. An even easier way to think about this would be like modern smartphones. There was not a time when we all had flip phones and then we all had smartphones and we're looking for some sort of transitional Palm Pilot to bridge the gap. These are just different technologies being developed at different times and integrated into different kinds of phones until eventually, collectively, the whole population trended towards smartphones. And bird evolution works the same way. We're talking about different groups of dinosaurs developing different traits at different times, creating competition between groups until eventually you get to modern birds. And species like Archaeopteryx and other early bird-like reptiles like Confuciusornis are just snapshots of that transition.
Indeed, far from being some unique dino bird, Archae shared much of its supposed unique anatomical structures with true birds that exist today, like the South American hoatzin, for example.
I don't know what this guy's talking about, but that's literally what the word transitional means in this context. I also don't know if I'm going to use that Watson line, because that's really, really stupid.
So much for Archaeopteryx as undeniable proof of evolution.
I just want to take a second to point out that the imagery of a creationist literally ripping up a book about evolution rather than just reading it is a great analogy for what organizations like Answers in Genesis actually do. That is the most honest part of this video, and I don't think they intended it to be.
Now, by 1868,
we don't really have to watch this next part, right? Like, we're gonna, because yeah, I guess we have to, but like, do we really have to? Can we just talk about Haeckel's embryo drawings and why they were wrong and why they don't even matter anymore? Do we really have to suffer through Answers in Genesis telling us again about one scientist that was wrong about one thing one time early in the development of his field, and then pretending like embryology hasn't taught us one single thing about evolution in almost 200 years? For those who don't know, Ernst Haeckel was a comparative embryologist back in the 1800s who studied embryos of different animals, noticed some striking similarities, glossed over a lot of really important differences, and then made broad generalizations which he tried to turn into laws, which is a very dangerous thing to do in biology. When the inaccuracy of Haeckel's drawings was exposed, we stopped using them. And then new scientists came up with better depictions of embryos, which still show a lot of similarities and still strongly support evolution, just not in the same way that Haeckel suggested. Through modern evolutionary developmental biology, or Evo-Devo for short, we now know that similar species have similar developmental pathways. And the more similar two species are, the more similar their development is. We no longer depict developmental differences as a funnel, where things start off very similar and then diverge from there. Instead, it looks a lot more like an hourglass, where things can start off pretty different, but they get more and more similar and then diverge again. And that narrow part of the hourglass, where individual species within one phylum look the most similar, is called the phylotypic stage. And there's a lot of debate among biologists as to whether or not the phylotypic stage is anything more than superficial, whether or not it actually really matters. In my grad school Evo-Devo class, my textbook said that the phylotypic stage mattered, my professor said that it didn't, and we spent a week reading scientific papers arguing in both directions. Because as I said earlier, questioning is always encouraged. That's the point of higher education. It's not about teaching you what to think, it's about just making you think. And it's also important to remember that as wrong as Haeckel's ideas were, they were more right than the ideas that came before them. Before Haeckel, there was Meckel-Serres law, which proposed that the development of an embryo directly paralleled the evolution of that species, meaning that each embryo would literally develop into the adult forms of every kind of organism leading up to it, from a worm to a fish to a frog to an ape. And before that, in the 1600s, it was proposed that each individual sperm contained a fully formed tiny human that was just waiting to expand like one of those toys you soak in water. And as silly as all of that sounds now, it's no different than the development of literally any other scientific theory. Take, for example, atomic theory. Dalton figured out that atoms of each individual element were identical, but he thought that atoms were solid, indivisible spheres. Then Thomson figured out that atoms had individual parts, but he thought that those parts were all smooshed together like plum pudding. Then Rutherford figured out that there's a central nucleus surrounded by electrons, but he didn't know anything about orbitals. Then Bohr figured out orbitals, but he didn't know anything about quantum mechanics. Finally, Schrödinger developed the quantum model of atoms that we still use today, and who knows what we don't know? The point is, science is self-correcting, and each field of study increases in resolution over time, getting more and more accurate with each new generation of scientists. It's not like we're going to find out tomorrow that atoms don't actually exist. We might just learn that they work in a different way than we expected, and the same is true of evolution. Anyway, let's see how Calvin's going to spin all that to say that you can't trust anything in science, but you can trust an Iron Age horror anthology.
By 1868, maybe the most cutting-edge proof presented to you might have been the supposed shocking similarity of animal and human embryos. Of course, modern science has shown that the idea that you start off like a worm, then become more like a fish, then become an ape-like creature, and finally a human while growing in your mom is absolutely ridiculous and would be laughed at by any educated person today.
I literally just said that. He must not have heard me.
And Haeckel's embryo drawings have now been admitted to being completely fraudulent. Forgeries made by this supposed great scientist's own hand, and the similarity argument has been shown false as well. And yet they were in textbooks up until my youngest daughter was in school just 15 years ago here in Canada.
First of all, that was way too much detail for that one sentence. You could have just said that it was in modern textbooks. You didn't have to say whose textbooks and what country you were in. That was a lot. It was very weird to say all that. Second of all, if your children's textbooks are that out of date, you should be fighting for better education funding, not for just worse education overall. Third, and most importantly, Haeckel is still talked about in modern biology textbooks to teach people about the history of the theory and help new scientists learn from the mistakes of scientists of the past. This is a modern evolutionary biology textbook, and right here is an entire paragraph about Haeckel. Today, Haeckel's biogenic law has been rejected in evolutionary biology, largely because we now know that natural selection and other evolutionary processes act at all stages of development, including the embryonic stages. As such, these stages are not static replays of phylogenetic history, but a more subtle mixture of phylogenetic history and adaptation at the embryonic stage. This dude is sitting here smugly pretending like he's sharing some shameful secret that debunks evolution, and it's literally taught in introductory evolutionary biology classes.
Now, by 1879, you may have felt scientists finally had the proof of evolution, as the American Journal of Science published an impressive diagram showing the supposed evolutionary development of horses, which found its way into many other publications and textbooks for years. Now, today, this proof of evolution has been abandoned because of the many severe challenges brought against it.
There's two things here that are very important to remember. The first is, that's not true. And the second is, this video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an everyday learning app with thousands of interactive lessons in science, programming, and more. Each one of their courses is fun, engaging, and built around problem solving rather than memorization. Because when it comes to learning, doing beats watching every time. Whether you're looking to crack the secrets of AI or sharpen your data analysis skills, Brilliant's hands-on approach puts you in control of your STEM education. And if you want to give Brilliant a try, you've come to the right channel, because they're offering my subscribers everything they have to offer absolutely free for a full 30 days, plus 20% off an annual subscription to Brilliant Premium, and all you got to do to get it is go to brilliant.org/Forrest Valkai, scan the QR code on the screen, or use the link in the description. When you do, be sure to check out their scientific thinking course. It's like a guided tour through the fundamental principles shaping the world around us. And just like the rest of Brilliant's courses, it's shaped by an award-winning team of experts from institutions like MIT and Caltech, so you know you're learning from the best. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to brilliant.org/Forrest Valkai, or scan the QR code on the screen, or use the link in the description to sign up for everything that Brilliant has to offer absolutely free for a full 30 days and 20% off an annual subscription to Brilliant Premium. It's fun, it's educational, and it makes the world a more curious place. That was nice. That was really nice. Okay. Now let's hear some more dumb stuff about horses and evolution or whatever.
Now, today, this proof of evolution has been abandoned because of the many severe challenges brought against it. For example, if the series were true, you'd expect to find the earliest fossils in the lowest rock strata. But you don't. In fact, bones of the supposed earliest horses have been found at or near the surface. Sometimes they're found right next to modern horse fossils.
Oh man, that sounds really bad. I wonder what scientific journal they're citing. Oh, silly me, it's not from a scientific journal at all. It's actually from their own website, reposting an article from a creationist magazine from 1995. That quote wasn't from a biologist. That quote was from Reverend Peter Hasty, a faculty member and former principal at Presbyterian Theological College in Melbourne, where Creation.com says he taught systematic theology and apologetics. I wonder why Answers in Genesis didn't think to mention where they got that quote. Considering they're usually very vocal about which biologist or biology textbook or other legitimate science resource they're misrepresenting, why do you think it is that when it came from somebody who isn't a biologist, someone who literally teaches apologetics for a living, they didn't think it was important to let you know the source? Maybe it's because they know that you wouldn't and shouldn't trust it, so they just put it on screen in quotes as if it was important when it really isn't. This is what I was talking about at the beginning of this video. All Answers in Genesis ever does is hide what their source is, lie about what their source says, and under no circumstance ever provide any evidence for creationism. All they do is give you reasons to doubt evolution, just as long as you don't check where they got those reasons from.
But instead of me listing all of the challenges here, I'll quote the evolutionist curator at the American Museum of Natural History, Dr. Niles Eldredge. I admit that an awful lot of that has gotten into the textbooks as though it were true. For instance, the most famous example still on exhibit downstairs in the American Museum is the exhibit on horse evolution prepared perhaps 50 years ago. That has been presented as literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now I think that's lamentable, particularly because the people who propose these kinds of stories themselves may be aware of the speculative nature of some of the stuff.
This is where we would normally use our technique of finding the original quote and reading the next sentence, but in this instance that's actually a little bit tricky, because that quote comes from a creationist book published in 1984 called Darwin's Enigma, Fossils and Other Problems. In that book, the author pulls quotes from interviews that he had with various scientists, including Eldredge, but he doesn't provide transcripts of those interviews, just little snippets of what he says those scientists said, along with what he says those scientists meant, which is one of the many reasons why that book was so heavily criticized, including by the people who were quoted in it. But even in that nefarious book, there's a little more to that quote that allows you to glean what Eldredge might have meant in that scenario. And Answers in Genesis was sure to cut that end of the quote off so that you didn't get to hear it. The actual end of the quote reads, "The people who propose these kinds of stories themselves may be aware of the speculative nature of some of the stuff. But by the time it filters down to the textbooks, we've got science as truth and we've got a problem." He wasn't lamenting that we taught people that horses evolved. He was lamenting that people were teaching hypotheses as truths. He referenced an out-of-date exhibit showing one hypothesis of horse evolution and was complaining that people were getting that one hypothesis as if it was gospel. He's criticizing science being taught as dogma, which is what any good scientist would do. If you take nothing else away from this video, I hope you remember just this one thing. Answers in Genesis just quote mined a quote mine. And even that had to be from the 1980s. They found a shady creationist misrepresenting a scientist, cut the quote down even further, and tried to sell you on the idea that this eminent paleontologist was saying that evolution is all just speculation. How does anyone take these people seriously?
So obviously the horse evolution series isn't irrefutable proof of evolution either.
At this point, you guys know that we've learned more stuff about horse evolution since the 1980s, right? You've got a half of a quote from a man saying that we shouldn't rely on outdated data, and you're using that to justify ignoring 40 years of new data. What are we doing?
Well, maybe by 1893, they'd show you the good stuff, the so-called scientific evidence of vestigial organs inside of us.
I'd like to take a second to point out that they're saying maybe by 1893 they'd show us the good stuff, and their last quote was from 1984. The structure of this video is insane.
These were supposed evidence of useless leftover parts inside us from our supposed evolutionary past.
Vestigial structures aren't necessarily completely useless. The word vestigial just means that it's a trait that's homologous to your clade, that it's become rudimentary or atrophied over evolutionary time, and that it has no known current function. The reason why a vestigial structure is a vestigial structure varies from case to case, but overall there are three main possibilities. One is that the trait isn't useful, but it also isn't all that costly, so it kind of just hangs around. Like the erector pili muscles that used to raise your fur to make you look big and keep warm, but now they just give you goosebumps. Number two is that the trait is costly and so it's currently on its way out. In that case, you probably won't see it in some portion of the population, like the palmaris longus muscle, which about 15% of people don't have, or wisdom teeth, which about 25% of people don't have at least one of. And number three is that the structure does have a function that we've just failed to identify. And depending on what that function is when we identify it, there's a couple of things that could happen. If the function is different than what the structure originally evolved for, like the pelvis of a whale for example, we're going to call that an exaptation, which means it evolved for one thing and then was repurposed to do something else. If, however, it has one function and no clear prior functions, like the thymus, then we're just not going to call that a vestigial structure anymore, because it isn't. The point is, this term is used to describe our understanding of a structure. But that doesn't mean that this is all just guesswork that we're using to justify our faith in evolution, which is certainly where Answers in Genesis is going with this. But even if that wasn't the case, there are plenty of examples of, for lack of a better word, useless structures that are leftovers of evolution. Examples like dew claws in dogs, pelvises in snakes, the auricular muscles that allow us to wiggle our ears, and many, many, many more.
And by this time, evolution-believing scientists like German anatomist Robert Widersham was claiming that our bodies contained over 86 of these useless organs, including the thymus, tonsils, adenoids, valves and veins, the parathyroid, and the pineal and pituitary glands.
And he published that in 1895. Just throwing that out there. We're 3/4 of the way into this video about debunking the best proof of evolution, and we're pulling source material that isn't even from this century.
Of course, not only have all now been shown to be functional, but some have been shown to be critical for life itself. Today's doctors would consider that old list laughable. And over the years, the list of so-called vestigial organs has shrunk to a handful of highly questionable examples, even within the evolutionary community itself.
If you can provide me evidence for why the blind Mexican cavefish that live in total darkness and have completely lost the use of their eyes actually need the functionless little remnants of eyeballs that they have to survive in those caves, then I will stop calling those rudimentary eye bits vestigial structures, because that is how honesty works. Now, please provide an example of you changing your beliefs and throwing out parts of the Bible based on new evidence.
Even the most commonly touted of all, the appendix, is now recognized as a highly specialized organ with a rich blood supply that manufactures several types of antibodies. It's not some useless relic.
Here's a paper from 2016 on why the vermiform appendix should no longer be considered vestigial. Before the 2000s, we didn't have any evidence for what it did, and removing it didn't have any major side effects. But then new evidence came in, and literature reviews like this one showed us that it does in fact have a distinct function, so we changed our minds. That paper alone has been cited over 250 times, which is huge in science, because it contains information and arguments that change our way of thinking. That's what scientists do. We change our minds when we have a good reason to do so. But Answers in Genesis has no concept of that. All they know how to do is try to poke holes in evolution, because they're so warped by dogma that they think if they can knock down a little bit of the evidence for our side, we will automatically have to accept their genuinely wacky beliefs. And I'm not talking about Christianity when I say that. They are so used to defending the claim that every single word of their interpretation of the Bible is literally, completely, and unequivocally true that they think finding any example of any evolutionist being wrong about anything is a good enough reason to warrant throwing out the most robust theory in the history of biology. the thing that makes medicine work, the thing that makes agriculture work, the thing that makes environmental science work, the thing that makes forensics work. Science is about starting with the evidence and building to a conclusion. Apologetics is about starting with a conclusion and then attacking any counter-evidence. Don't let them trick you into thinking those are the same.
And it's not just the fact that these vestigial organ claims kept getting knocked off the list. It's the fact that the whole concept itself is a terrible proof of evolution to begin with. Ultimately, evolution is about how supposedly new structures, forms, functions, and features came to exist, not about the degeneration of existing structures over time.
That is not what evolution is about. Evolution is any change in the heritable characteristics of a population over the course of multiple generations. That could include gaining structures, or it could include losing structures, or it could include changing structures, or it may not include structures at all. But Answers in Genesis will never admit that, because as long as they can paint evolution as only meaning major, dramatic, macroevolutionary changes over a relatively short period of time, they can make the whole thing sound a lot more fantastical than it really is, and they can write off all of the undeniable evidence for evolution as just changes within kinds.
Something that used to have a function, but no longer does, is no direct help to the story of evolution. So these once great proofs of evolution have ended up in the dustbin as well.
Do you notice how they're talking out of both sides of their mouth here? They started out by saying that vestigial structures aren't real because they're just things that we used to think were functionless, but we have since found a function for. The problem is, there's a lot more things out there that actually are functionless. So rather than dying on the indefensible hill of, there's actually a function, we just haven't figured it out and we'll be proven right someday, they're now switching gears and saying, it doesn't matter if they're functionless, because evolution has to be about gain, not loss. Because why would they spray you with just one fire hose of bullcrap when they can use two?
Now, by 1912, you'd finally have been shown some truly dynamic fossil evidence found in a gravel pit near Piltdown in England. The skull of an ancient ape man dubbed Piltdown Man was presented as overwhelming proof of our evolutionary ancestry.
No, it was not. Piltdown Man was a hoax, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. But even at the time that it was taken seriously, we had more than enough evidence to accept evolution. And Piltdown Man was very controversial, with lots of scientists calling it a fake, all the way up until it was proven to be one 30 years later using new technologies like fluorine dating.
This supposed proof was displayed in museum exhibits and textbooks as proof positive that human beings had descended from ape-like ancestors. But once again, 4 decades later, the evidence was re-examined and revealed as a fraud. It wasn't even a good fraud, as you could easily see how the teeth from a jawbone had been filed down to make them look more human, and the bones had been chemically treated to make them look very old.
You can easily see that? I mean, anatomists and dentists of the time were saying that, but there were plenty of other biologists that were fooled. Where did you get your anatomy training to make you so confident to say that you can easily see that the wear patterns of those teeth and the discoloration of those bones were clearly faked? Or is that just something that you say to make yourself feel so much smarter than all those silly biologists 100 years ago?
It was simply a combination of an old human skull and a modern ape jawbone stuck together. So much for that proof of evolution.
Just out of curiosity, do you know how we found out that Piltdown Man was fake? It was because we found so many real fossils of actual human ancestors that demonstrated that something like that all the way over in England simply wasn't possible. And so the fossil was re-examined using modern technology, like fluorine dating that I mentioned earlier, which wasn't available until the 1940s, and we found out that it was a fraud. Better science made science better. And you know how I know that? Here's my undergraduate bioanthropology textbook, and here is their 2-page spread on Piltdown Man. Once again, this guy is acting like he has some dark and shameful secret about biology, and it's literally used every day to make biologists into better biologists. But since we're talking about how a few scientists being fooled by a hoax and then later changing their minds in spite of new evidence is apparently reason enough to discredit an entire field of study, do you want to talk about some of the rampant hoaxes in biblical archaeology? Like, say, for example, the Shroud of Turin, which lots of creationist apologists still believe in, despite the fact that it has been regularly and thoroughly debunked. Or what about one of the many, many times that the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly found? Or one of the countless times that Noah's Ark was supposedly discovered? I mean, Ron Wyatt alone has to be worse than Haeckel and whoever made Piltdown Man combined, right? Or are we only going to talk about times when real scientists make mistakes because that's the only time that it matters to you?
But wait.
And there's your answer. Their next point is Nebraska Man. Not even a hoax, just one single scientist who misidentified one single tooth one single time. Newspapers ran with it, the scientific community did not, and creationists are still talking about it over 100 years later.
By 1917, just 5 years later in the US, they found some powerful evidence for evolution when a Nebraskan rancher found what he thought was a special kind of tooth on his farm. And an evolution-believing paleontologist friend of his was excited at the prospect it must have come from an ape man. He produced a portrait of Nebraska Man, a hairy ape man, along with his ape woman wife in a scientific journal. And this was touted as great scientific proof for evolution.
Publishing something in a scientific journal does not mean that the scientific community automatically accepts it as true. That's just what you do when you learn a new thing and you want to share it with other experts in your field so that they can fact check you. When the tooth was shown not to be human, that journal article was retracted. I understand that peer review and fact checking and honesty are unfamiliar concepts for Answers in Genesis, but I promise you, when you care about whether or not the things you believe are actually true, that sort of situation tends to happen from time to time, and it's okay.
However, several years later, scientists confirmed that the tooth had come from a pig. The whole fiasco had nothing to do with apes or people. It had everything to do with evolutionary presuppositions that drove false conclusions, all based on laughably flimsy evidence. So you can toss that proof of evolution away as well.
Again, this whole fiasco was caused by sensationalist media, not bias among scientists. One scientist made one mistake and immediately retracted his claims when other scientists proved him wrong. That's the actual story here. It's genuinely weird how big of a deal creationists make this.
So we'll end here for now.
Thank Gilgamesh.
But stay tuned for part 2 of Evolution Over Time,
No thank you.
where we'll show even more examples of supposed proof of evolution that have come and gone.
Will any of them be from this century? You said you were going to debunk the best proof of evolution, and your last example was from 1922. Maybe next time we can talk about some evidence from after when penicillin was discovered. Well, that video really sucked, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for Answers in Genesis, nor was it anything out of the scope of most introductory biology textbooks. Overall, I give this video a science teacher challenge level 2 out of 10. These are super common arguments, and they're popular for a reason. When you stack them all together like this, it can make science look like this bumbling, clumsy thing that's just desperately trying to sell you a story. But if you know how science actually works, and you take the time to read just one more sentence out of all of their sources, you'll be just fine. But the best part of this video is that it means I never have to watch anything that Answers in Genesis posts ever again because they've already admitted that evolution is true. And don't just take my word for it, here's a direct quote from the Executive Director of Answers in Genesis Canada, Calvin Smith.
The fossil record proves evolution happened. Don't you idiots understand science? Evolution is a fact.
See? I mean, surely they wouldn't have a problem with quote mining, right? There are still a few spots left on my upcoming trips to Borneo and Germany, so be sure to sign up for those if you're interested. And after many requests, I finally added a cetacean needed shirt to my merch store, so be sure to grab one of those if you're into textiles or whatever. And with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop, pick up one of these sweet t-shirts. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye.